Part 1. A Spark in the Darkness. The coldest day that I can remember. Well, the second coldest day I can remember. The most cold day I have a memory of is leaving Luke, death vegetable of the Cult of the Dead Cow, with the camera equipment of a film project I was working on that left him in the middle of a courtyard with constantly blowing frigid winds, leaving him an icicle when we got back. So the second coldest day I remember was getting up with my grandfather to go on a trip with him at 5 a.m. All of this was new to me, getting up at 5, loading into a truck, having no heat, just grabbing on to myself and my jacket. I was very young, 10, 11, and we were going fishing. The driveway of the house had one light next to the front door, but there wasn't overarching light. It was a sky just beginning to lighten up, with stars and the moon still visible, and we were getting into the truck to drive for a while before the fish woke up, as he put it. I just remember feeling so absolutely lost with him because we didn't hang out much. Besides family, we didn't have much in common, and I was in a sort of half-state, a liminal space between two parts of my life, the divorce and my discoveries of the way the world was going to be, and also visiting this farmhouse in upstate New York, surrounded essentially by nothing. So when we would go up there, we would always stay over because there was no way to get back to the house in any sort of reasonable time and still have a full visit. I have many memories of going to this farmhouse and sleeping in the guest rooms with nothing. No lights, no sounds, no distractions. Things that very soon would be everywhere, would be a fundamental part of my being. But at this point was just darkness. It was so cold that morning because I had come from nothing and I was going to nothing. Looking back, I realize it was because I was so addicted to electricity and electronics, even then, that anything else felt like living half a life of just sleeping to sleep, to ride somewhere and just ride, to hear the quiet of nature and be utterly, consistently bored, craving distraction and constant streams of information. That space between a world before and a world after that I found myself straddling leads me to think about multiple bridging between worlds that I have experienced in my life. And as the latest one rains down, I'm lucky and I'm gifted to see what's happening, to understand it as it happens. I get to know, here we go again. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. At this point, let's just talk about the first revolution. Like many world-changing events, my world-changing events have official dates, official figures and moments and locations that I've burned in to a sort of ersatz narrative, something where I say this happened, then this happened, then this happened. If you've heard any of these episodes, you know about them. I don't think that they should have the same weight for others that they did for me, but they represent moments that were, in my way, hugely reflective of where the directions of my life were going to go, and maybe, for others, a reflection of where they themselves were turned in a new direction. When I say revolution, I don't mean some sort of overthrow or a destructive force moving through. I mean a shift in perspective, a way of living changed out from under me or out from under the world I was in. There are good revolutions, just as there are bad ones. There are ones that happen and simply become a new set of names for a bunch of work and a bunch of ideas that you had before the supposed revolution. For me, it is Chris Buford's grandparents' den that had a modem and a phone and an IBM PC calling into a bulletin board system and realizing in one beautiful avalanche how nothing was going to be the same. How these computers that had been part of my growing up, that I had fallen in love with, were going to gain an ability that, in regular history, we know we had for decades. But now this ability was going to affect me directly. The ability to communicate with other computers. That any piece of equipment taken from any sort of department store or computer store or from a junk pile or a school would have, with a small amount of investment, the capability to leave messages, transfer files, and become islands in an already misunderstood virtual space. That was my revolution. Even though the bulletin board system that Chris Buford connected me to was a simple one, maybe a couple dozen users, leaving messages of no consequence, completely in uppercase because many of the computers lacked a lowercase chip. That we were connecting from one town to another, from an IBM PC to an Apple II, and we were living a life that was not in this room, that was not connected to this furniture and boxes and curtains, but lived in this other place, a place not connected to where the other machine was, but between us. That changed my mind. From that point on, I was no longer walking down sidewalks. I was no longer traveling in a school bus or being in a class or being at home. I was not in this other place. Like glancing on a paradise from a passing train, I saw a destination that was not mine quite yet, and I wanted a ticket. And in his showing of love and support, my father purchased a modem for his computer at his house, and I began using it, connecting to bulletin board systems all throughout the country, and then, after being yelled at, all over the state, and after being yelled at, all over a small select version of exchanges in my area code, and observing these different places, these different outlooks, these ideas that became worlds in my mind. And I was utterly hooked. Bulletin board systems, throughout my teen years, ebbed and flowed in terms of importance, but their concept, their fundamental concept that I could go through these different places, that somewhere other than the reality I was living was a set of phone numbers that called into worlds, stuck with me. I made friends and acquaintances. I had phone conversations and in-person meetings with people that I met. And I talked, and I learned, and I gathered information onto floppy disks, considering that these entire worlds were too good to be true, that by that point in my life, I was ready for disappointment. And while my own personal journey was happening, the world wrestled with the ramifications and the meaning of these bulletin board services. How would they affect life as we knew it? Should they be regulated? Should they be considered to be part of the phone company? Was the use of a phone line as a computer bulletin board a business case, something where you needed to have the line business ready? Was it something that should be regulated by the post office, by the FCC, by any of a number of local, state, and federal entities? What were we going to do about protecting various people, about requiring additional costs to handle the fact that homes that only had one phone line were suddenly getting 2 or 3 or 4 to accommodate these growing bulletin boards? I can assure you there are gallons of ink spilled about what are we going to be as a society with bulletin boards at their core. Where are we going to end up? Are we in a new era, or are we in a dystopia? Pop culture, news stories, radio talk shows, everybody had an opinion on what these might be. Many of them sowed fear. Many of them said this was an unknown thing, and from it can only cause death, destruction, and sadness. Your children will be victimized. Your businesses will be attacked. Society will fall apart from the distancing of these computer bulletin board systems. And through it all, I loved them. I loved the spirit of the funny ones. I loved the content of the serious ones. Calling into CompuServe and downloading everything I could on a free account, or going to a chatting system and meeting new people. This stayed in the back of my life throughout my teen years and the beginning of my 20s. These were absolutely, in my mind, places. They have memories like a favorite bar, a favorite beach, a favorite hangout spot for you and your friends. In the same way that my heart might warm thinking about a wall in the condo development that my mother lived in, I held the same deep emotions for a bulletin board system number that I can remember a quarter of a century later. That these, in the most simplistic sense, were home computers connected to hard drives and using modems to answer phones, I thought of them as fantastical environments that I could know and a select group of friends and acquaintances could share knowledge of and live in. In retrospect, of course, all of this can be quantified. You can tell yourself that a phone call could only be done one at a time on these early bulletin boards, that you would have an Apple II with a 10 megabyte hard drive that cost $600 or $800, that somebody was pouring money into keeping the phone lines up, and that these system operators might in fact be teenagers with rapidly shifting priorities. So a bulletin board may go down just for the reasons of life. No grandiose fall, no incredible drama, just I'm going to school. I've decided I want the phone line back. I want to no longer hear a machine humming in the living room. But at the time, after a day of wearing the cloak of a human, of acting like I was just another kid, just another teenager, taking long walks to go and get anything of value, waiting and waiting and waiting at malls and shopping centers for my parents or my friends to finish what they were doing, going to movies and eating at the diner, all of it fell to the wayside when I would pick up a phone, dial a number, and wait with anticipation for that first ring before the click as the song began of a modem that was ready to connect and be the lifeblood of an entire other universe that I'd be traveling to, a different one every night. Each time taking longer and longer to get through as bulletin boards became more popular, or taking over one that wasn't popular yet to put my stamp on it, until the first flecks of dawn came through the window, and I was living in two worlds again, being pulled away from the computer and these texts and these proportional fonts that gave me dreams and nightmares, and realizing that once again I'd lived in there a little bit too long, and I was going to be tired in the regular, the mundane, the uninteresting world of real life. Looking back and quantifying these bulletin boards, I can look back and I can also quantify the value of fishing trips with grandparents, of family events, of seeing friends, or sitting on a chair while people talked about nothing, observing them and learning how people interact, what they say to each other when they mean something but they say something else, the subtle shifts in body posture and positioning that send messages of their own. At the time, I saw no value in them, but it's only been decades that I realized that both these worlds had validity. The attempts by each, from the virtual world of bulletin boards and the real world of flesh and bone, were silly territorial fights for the possession of me, of my wishes and my efforts. Each one wanted me, and I loved each in their own way. When the chips were down, teenage me fell, not so much for the dark world of reality and family and trips and memories, but that oh so subtle spark in the darkness. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Martin, Symbionts, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. This is part 1 of 4.